Background for this next question. Congress is currently discussing the extension of the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Emergency Fund, also known as TANF, which expires on September 30th. Earlier this year, another important federal program was nearly not reauthorized because of concerns over the federal budget deficit. Had that program, Federal Medical Assistance Percentages, or FMAP, not passed, the state would have lost more than $500 million in services and jobs. Now, there's similar resistance to extending the TANF Emergency Fund. Nearly $138 million is at stake in Massachusetts. Over the past 2 years, this fund has helped Massachusetts meet the need for homelessness services, child care, and cash assistance benefits, such as the Children's Clothing Allowance. If the emergency fund is not extended, these and other critical benefits would be on the chopping block. The question is, what specific steps would you take to fight to extend this federal emergency fund, and how will you work to ensure similar federal programs like FMAP get funded, and that the money is used exclusively for our human service programs as intended? Candidate Patrick, we'll have you answer first.
First of all, I've been active in Congress of the United States directly and through our delegation fighting for TANF and for programs like it to support human services. When we were when the Congress was debating the stimulus bill, I was in the center of that with a handful of other governors trying to assure that kids in our schools and people who depend on human services aren't expected to sit out the recession and wait for their services to be restored. We're about, it seems to be, a stronger community, and a community pulls together in a time of crisis. And I have lots of examples of my being present personally and in the face of our congressional leaders and the new administration advocating for these funds, and with our delegation. And I'll continue to do that if the people will honor me with a second term.
Candidate Stein?
I would, add that, everything that the governor can do, I will do, including working with our congressional delegation, going to Washington, D.C., and working with other states that are fighting similar battles. And I would also just raise the issue that while we are so hurting for federal support, remember that we are spending close to $1 trillion a year on a war that is hard to justify, and not only sending our young men and women there through our National Guard, but also sending what amounts to $9 million a day of Massachusetts federal tax money. $9 million a day. Imagine what that would do. And I would really work with the peace movement in this state and across the many states in order to drive that fact home. This war has gone on too long, it's not moving us in the right direction, and it's virtually impossible for us to both have a military budget of the size that it is and meet our needs at home.
Candidate Baker.
I know something about this issue, I don't know the details. What I will say, though, is I worry a great deal about what this generation is doing to and for the next generation, with the rate at which we spend money for which we don't have the cash on hand to pay the bills. The federal government's deficit is as big as it's ever been in this nation's history, and it's expected that unless something very weird happens, it will continue to retain its enormous size, really of historic proportions far into the future. State government has a deficit this year, even if you count the FMAP money, and probably a $2 billion deficit next year. The day of reckoning on all of this stuff is for real. And as somebody who has 3 kids and hopes those 3 kids grow up and each has 3 kids of their own, et cetera, I worry a lot that the federal government does not have the ability to live within its means. And I think state governments suffer from the same problem. And I'm a big believer that if you truly want to make sustainable investments in communities, you have to start by fiscally balancing your budget and living within your means to begin with.
Candidate Cahill?
Yes, some of I agree with what Candidate Baker said. There's people on the left as well, that we have to fight hard for every dollar that we can get out of Washington. especially if it's going to other states, but at the same time, we cannot continue to borrow and print money. States have to live within their means. I think the federal government should start living within its means as well. But when it comes down to values, I agree with candidate Stein. We cannot continue to give tax credits to corporations or companies, spread that money out to biotech firms and to high-tech firms when that money, if we truly have values and we want to maintain the safety net and we care about all the things that you care about, then that's where the money needs to be spent. We can't be all things to all people, but government needs to be there for the most needy, the poorest, the disabled, the people that can't do it on their own, or the families that can't do it on their own. So it is about values, and we do have to start to choose what we can afford to do, what we cannot afford to do. These are needed programs, there's no question about that. We have to get tighter, and we have to get tougher with how we spend that money and how we deliver those services. But it's possible to do it. Nothing is impossible. We just need to be realistic about the future. We cannot continue to borrow forever, both federally or state, and we cannot continue to be dependent on the federal government, because they won't always be there for us. We have to be self-sufficient, and that's what I will try to do for the next 4 years as governor. Create a self-sufficient state.
Thank you. We're going to go back.